This meeting is now being recorded.
Look at that. All right, we're rolling. So thank you all for joining us. My name, of course, is Rob Johnstone. I am the founder and president of NCII, and I know that I've seen many of you out on the campuses on visits, and we're happy to have you with us today on the phone. I couldn't be more excited to have my colleague and friend, Priya Chaplot, who is NCI's Vice President of Strategy, who I've known for a very long time, and I think this may be her first official event since being back from maternity leave. So no one is happier about this day than me. And Priya and I have been on this journey for about a decade now, and it's very exciting to be at this stage. My only intro to this will be to say that when we started A2I2, the idea that Priya and I had was to really help colleges focus deeply on both guided pathways and student financial stability reform. And the reality of the marketplace right now in the landscape nationally is that the guided pathways movement, through some of our efforts, so we can't really argue with this, has really taken off and become a framework that colleges can consider a lot of their improvement efforts by. And the student financial stability work around the country, which is great in pockets, hasn't quite reached the same level of steam yet. And so we do not in any way mean to...
We're asking a favor.
Yeah, I think I think you got in. I think you got in.
All right. So I'm going to be muting people as they join. So thank you for coming on in, and we're going to do all of the questions in chat. But I just want to let Priya go ahead and get started and say that we really still see these as inextricably intertwined, the roles of guided pathways and student financial stability. You could set up the best guided pathways in the world, have great onboarding processes, have really clear pathways, have great monitoring, but without students having the financial stability to focus on their studies and actually remain in college and dedicate themselves to their work, the best laid plans on the guided pathway side are not going to be optimized for many of our lowest income students. Priya and I have come at this with both heart and soul because we both kind of went through our experiences being very low-income students, and so this is a particular passion of ours. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn the rest of the webinar over to my good colleague and friend, Priya Chaplot, and I will be monitoring the chat for questions and occasionally pausing to see if you have any additional questions. So welcome to the third webinar for A2I2, and we are going to go ahead and get rolling, Priya.
Thank you, Rob, and I am so happy to be here. Trying to de-rust my brain and move all the cobwebs out, but this is one of the most important pieces of work I think Rob and I have worked on in the last decade, and I'm happy today to be able to share some of the thinking and some of the work that we've done in hopes that as you and your teams think about redesigning your pathways, designing revised options for students and getting more coherent and structured programs of study, what Rob and I would like to do through today's webinar is give you some considerations about how to support students beyond the classroom, how to support students beyond even the campus in the types of challenges that can really affect their ability to get in a program of study and stay in a program of study. Now, this is going to be an institutional discussion about what the role of the institution is. So this will be an institution-wide discussion about what the role of the institution is in supporting students and how far that support can go. But what I'd like to do today in the webinar is give you some thoughts about how other colleges have approached this work, give you some strategies about how you can think about embedding this in the work that you're doing, whether it's with guided pathways or even with your equity efforts, and then also provide some resources towards the end of this session. So Rob, next please. So I'm going to start with the most important players in the work that we do, the stories of students, and then use that as a way to build some principles around the work of student financial stability. And then the rest of the time we're going to spend together will be around looking at strategies for strengthening the stability of students financially and also how different colleges have done it. So I'm just going to try to provide as many examples as possible in hopes that parts of what other colleges are doing might resonate with the kind of culture that you have or the kind of resources that you have. There is a lot of information, and I will try to get through some of it to whet your appetite and help you think about how to incorporate this in your work. Rob and I are obviously available after the webinar if you'd like to ask any questions about any of the college examples, or if you'd like to get some more information, support, etc. Next, Rob. So as Rob mentioned, I am a new parent, and obviously I was up in odd hours of the night last night, as every night, and I came across a story in the Los Angeles Times that was just published yesterday, and the story itself is called He Attends Elite UC Berkeley and Lives in a Trailer with No Heat or Sewer Hookups. Soon he will be scrambling to find new shelter. It was basically a photojournalist expose on one student's experience in balancing schoolwork and the responsibilities of being kind of taking care of his family and his younger siblings. There was a quote in there, for example, it said, Ismail constantly scrambles to find shelter and enough food for himself and his siblings while working a campus job, leading a school club, and trying to earn a bachelor's degree in sociology. And there were a whole series of black and white photos, and the one that really got me was this of his siblings doing their work in the foreground and Ismail all the way in the back, sitting at the white table, preparing for his exam. And the truth of the matter is this is not new information for us, especially us who work in community colleges. Many of our students face all sorts of basic need challenges that affect the ability that they have to be able to come to school and stay focused on the programs that they have. And between yesterday's news and today, there's already a GoFundMe campaign out there that's raising funds for him to be able to help his family afford a house, and that's wonderful. And it just made me think about, well, what about the other tens of thousands of students that are in this position? So I really want us to think about structured support, where it doesn't have to be a student bumping into the right professor at the right time or a staff member or an advisor at the right time to be able to get the support they need. But how can we think about structurally and systematically providing supports for our students where it's just part of their standard college-going experience, that they prepare for their academics, and they also are supported in making sure other types of basic needs that they may have to attend to are also somewhat addressed and supported by the institution. Next. Another report that was done by TICAS, the Institute for College Access and Success, they published a report a couple of years ago about how would limited financial support affect their ability to come to school, and more importantly, what kind of choices would they make if their resources did not stretch far enough? So what are the trade-offs that students are facing as they're coming to school and managing the rest of their lives? And so I just picked a couple of quotes out, but the entire report is really illuminating about student voices and what it is that they're choosing between when they're coming to school. So for example, a student says, I have created a bare necessities budget. I have no money for anything else except school. I don't mind paying only for school, but I do become disheartened when it becomes difficult even with such a restricted budget. Another student talks about having to decide between paying for bills or paying for groceries or paying for books. And these are not unheard of stories. These are actually very common struggles that many of our students are facing. But it happens outside, and there are different efforts that colleges have made to address parts of these issues. Next, Rob. Another resource that I think is just kind of mind-blowing is something called First Generation Low-Income Partnerships, or FLIPs. These are student-run organizations that basically provide a space for first-generation and low-income students to share their concerns and peers in a safe setting. Now, what's interesting about FLIPs is that they're usually at more elite institutions that you wouldn't think of having a large number of low-income students. So, for example, Columbia University in New York City, actually the FLIP there at the campus run by students has a Tumblr page and a Facebook page where different students will just share what their life is like, and in hopes that they raise awareness about their experiences, they build a community, and they've even been instrumental in working with the administration there through these voices to be able to have some level of change happen. So this is another student talking about how they're feeling pigeonholed, choosing between part-time school and going to work full-time, and the impact that it has on their ability to afford other important experiences that they have as well. So, Rob, next slide. So now I know I started on a really down note, but this is hopefully not a reality that is new. This is a reality that we currently face and that our students currently face. And today, the rest of our time together is really to talk about hope and optimism about what is possible and what is already happening. And so I just want to offer 4 guiding principles for the work that Rob and I have done, and then jump into what is happening and what is possible. So the first and most important guiding principle is just acknowledging that there is a large and growing number of students in college that are juggling multiple responsibilities, coming to school, working part-time, full-time, being parents or taking care of other family members, and also just managing their finances. And these real-life challenges affect their ability to come to school and complete whatever their educational goals are, whether it's to earn a degree or earn a certificate or transfer, whatever it may be. Now, also historically what we've seen is that when institutions do spend intentional effort to structure and offer these types of supports in a coherent and consumable way, it benefits students and it benefits the college itself. As Rob mentioned at the beginning of this call, at the end of the day, the work that is being done around guided pathways is extremely honorable, extremely important for students having more coherent experiences. But sometimes there are external issues that will jeopardize any progress a student will make, regardless of how beautifully those pathways and programs and services are designed. So thinking a little bit about how to marry the work of the guided pathways work with this more holistic and broader and comprehensive set of supports for students would actually support the ability of students to complete their educational goals. Next.
Yeah, and Priya, I mean,
okay.
A lot of folks have heard me talk about in front of the room sometimes about how we need to have a better value proposition so more of our students can go full-time, because we know the depressing rates of success for part-time students who never go more than 9 units and their ultimate completion rates in community colleges. And I mean, whenever I do that, I bring up this point that we have to work on both sides of this. We have to work on the financial support side. We also have to work on helping these students understand the value proposition to trying to make the investment of time and resources to come. And it's a balancing act. I don't think there's a science to finding that perfect balance, but we know both of these things matter a lot, and it's the intersection between them that I think is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, as I mentioned earlier, providing this type of support, it's not impossible. There are many colleges that are doing really innovative work around taking what they're already doing and elevating it so students are able to access more resources, or finding ways to be able to acknowledge and get in front of student needs before students actually ask for the support. So we're going to share a little bit of that today. And then lastly, and most importantly, it's really important to think about this as an ecosystem, to think about this in the big picture of what it takes to make this work. So it's guided pathways and equity efforts and multiple measures, but it's also thinking about the institutional processes and policies, what needs to be undone, what needs to be revised that will be able to kind of collectively force this change forward. Next one. So we'll start again with another story from Georgia State University, which in the last 12 maybe years has gone through a pretty incredible change. Next slide, Rob. When they first started in the early 2000s, their graduation rate was about 31%. And even though Georgia State University is a 4-year university, its demographics mirror those of community college students. For example, 58% of the students at the college are Pell eligible students, 3 out of 5. And so we think that this is an interesting example because it shows how long it takes, but also what is possible and what can actually build leverage and build steam moving forward. So what they started to do in the early 2000s was they started to look at fall-to-fall retention, but they didn't stop there. Next slide. So they were, go ahead. And so they were looking at their fall-to-fall retention, but they also wanted to see when a student is retained from one year to the next, are they coming into the second year as a sophomore? And so you can see in the very beginning, 22% of their students were coming in at sophomore level, and over the last, I think this was until fall 8, so about those 8 years, it had increased dramatically. Next slide. And so how did they do this? Over the last 10 years, and Georgia State University is an incredible example that either Rob and I could probably talk about for great length, but this is just a quick snapshot of the fact that it wasn't one thing. It wasn't one magic bullet that fixed this issue for them. They implemented probably over a dozen high-impact strategies over a period of 10 years to be able to figure out how to support students. And so they systematically addressed progression and graduation, but they used a lot of data and analytics. They even created these alerts, over 800 alerts, to track how students are doing. So if a student fell off their track, there would be an alert. It would go to a staff member, and the staff member would contact the student. So it was a long-term process, but it was an incredible journey of marrying the academics and the non-academics to be able to support students. It wasn't one specific thing, but a variety of measures, which we can talk about in a little bit. And what ended up happening, Georgia State University had, like I mentioned, started with 31% as their graduation rate. Over the last 10 years, their graduation rate has climbed to 50%. And what's amazing is that African American students, Hispanic students, first-generation students, Pell-eligible students, all graduated from Georgia State University at levels above those of the student body overall, making this college the only public national university to be able to have that goal. Their students are gaining at rates of over 30 points in terms of completion and graduation. And again, it's based on this kind of comprehensive look at what does the student need and what should our default student experience be. So how many students are we talking about? There are different ways to be able to describe low-income students. Oh, next slide, Rob. And low-income students can be described by based on their family level or their family income or their family size. It can be based on their other types of measures as well. So here are some proxies that can be used to define low-income students, whether or not they're eligible for the Pell Grant, whether or not they're receiving the Pell Grant, how much their family is expected to contribute. The one that is, I think, really helpful is number 4, unmet financial need. An unmet financial need is basically the gap between how much it costs to go to school. This includes your tuition, your fees, your books, your living expenses, and what students can pay using the types of aid that are available, which include grants, scholarships, family contribution. And this is an interesting marker. So Georgia State University, for example, tracked the unmet financial need for every single student that entered the college using that gap, basically. Next slide. Now, the College Board also does a report every year where they look at how many students are receiving Pell Grants as the proxy. That's another proxy that can be used at your institution if you're looking at how many you would classify as low income, for example. And over the years, it's been about 1 in 3. 1 in 3 American undergraduates receive Pell Grants. And just in that phrase alone, it actually describes why this number is actually undercounting what our students are probably facing. Number 1, this assumes that, or this doesn't assume that all eligible students who could have applied for financial aid, who would have been eligible, didn't apply. So it's undercounting those students. It's also undercounting because this is all undergraduate students, and we know that more low-income students tend to choose community colleges to be able to come to school. And so even though here it says 1 in 3 students, it's likely that it's higher, and in many cases much higher. We've been to institutions where they enacted measures just assuming that every single student could benefit from this because they had 90% of their students, for example, be Pell eligible. So this is to make the case that the supports that could be provided would benefit large numbers of students on your campus. Next slide, Rob. And so large numbers of students, this is where we can talk about low-income students, but this is a shaded Venn diagram that really pulls in a bunch of other student populations. So you're talking about first-generation students, students who have children, students that are undocumented, veterans, foster youth. So other underrepresented student populations could also benefit from the types of supports that would be focused in when we talk about this kind of financial stability for students.
And Priya, one of the things we talk about, I just was down in Maricopa last week, we talk about this a lot, is that, we very often are comfortable, disaggregating things by income levels and not as comfortable disaggregating by race. And I've made the point, and probably in front of most of your rooms, that we need to become a little more fluid with this, because by talking about income, although certainly there's poverty across all of the spectra of race and ethnicity, disproportionately we are talking about students of color when we're talking about low-income students. And I've said probably somewhat controversially that we need to talk about this, and we need to talk about this as whites talking with our Latino, African American, Southeast Asian, across racial divides that we bring to the table, because these issues are very real, and they're particularly real for low-income students who are students of color. So I want to make sure that everyone is aware that we are aware of that distinction, and also work it into the way we think about this work, and why we think that equity and institutional racism have to be thrown on the table and discussed as you do this work. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's Rob, I'm glad you mentioned that. There's another graphic that is going to bring that point home about how important and how inextricably linked race, ethnicity, and or issues of equity are around issues of income and financial support as well. Okay, next slide. So yes, in this one, this kind of comes back to what are we talking about when we talk about student financial stability? What are we talking when we talk about holistic supports for students? And we're really talking about the basic needs, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs demonstrates some of the most foundational and fundamental supports that humans need, and in this case we're talking about students need, in order to be able to focus on academics, et cetera. And so we're talking about students having reliable and adequate access to food, housing, transportation, if their parents' child care, their own health care, their family's health care, legal services, tax services, mental health services. And these are just the kind of usual suspects when it comes to the types of support. Depending on your college, you might have other issues or other challenges that your own students in the community face that might be more important to address as well. And as Rob had mentioned earlier, no matter how guided your pathways are, students facing challenges related to these supports can undo a lot of the progress that they make. And so how does this impact their progress? Their inability to, whether it's afford academic expenses like books and parking and those lab expenses, or whether it's kind of family and external issues, these can force students to take less classes, work more hours, or take the same number of classes but spend less attention on those classes. It could be about cutting course loads. It could be about borrowing more money. And when we also talk about student financial stability, we're talking about loans as a last resort. We're talking about what other types of supports can students get that they don't have to pay back, because that adds a different level of stress to the students. There was a study that was done in 2009 by Public Agenda, where they asked students, why did you leave college before finishing? And the majority of students said that they needed to work to support themselves, their families. They couldn't afford the tuition. So financial supports and financial stability really impact the decisions of students while they're in school on how they go to school and if they go to school at all. It also impacts completion. So in many cases, low-income students are less likely to complete college, less likely to earn their awards, whether they're certificates or degrees. And it's important here because we're really talking about students spending so much time making progress in their work and then not completing. In some cases, students taking semesters and years of time and then still not completing. So what is it that we can do that allows them to be able to make progress, and not just make progress, but actually complete whatever educational goal they set for themselves?
And Priya, this is something that we talk about around student loan default rates, but also the high percentage of students that flock to for-profit institutions for the promise of flexibility and the ability to complete and get into careers, which have even worse student loan default rates, especially by ethnicity. So we can't pretend that completion doesn't matter. It very much does in the marketplace, and it particularly matters for low-income students. I mean, that recent statistics that came out of Judith Scott Clayton's work, where if you're white in this country and you complete a degree at a non-for-profit university, there's a 4% loan default rate in the first 12 years after graduation. If you're African American, attend a for-profit university and don't complete, the loan default rate is 67%. And so this matters. It matters on a number of levels. And, we talk a little bit about economic mobility in the Guided Pathways world as being a key driver of our reason for this. But this issue of completion and non-completion really for students of color and low-income students is really an enormous one that we have to wrestle with in community colleges in this country.
Yeah, that's actually a really good segue into this next slide, which when Rob and I first saw it was such a kind of an eye-opening slide for us. So there was a study done in 2009 that was looking at college graduation rates based on income and based on test scores. And in this case, you can see we're looking at the two brown circles, for example. The students that were in the highest income bracket were able to complete college at a rate of 30%, even if they had below average test scores. So 30% of students were able to complete college, as opposed to 26%. 26% of students, even though they had above average test scores, but were in the lowest income bracket, were completing. And so this was saying that high-performing, low-income students were less likely to graduate than their low-performing, high-income peers. I mean, this is really talking about this belief that we have that college is a meritocracy. We talk about where the smart students graduate and the weaker or the unmotivated students do not. But when we saw this, the thing that jumped out is resources matter. Resources matter more than we even give them credit for in the ability of students to come and be successful. And given the strong correlation, as Rob was just mentioning, between low-income status and race in the country, there might be no stronger evidence than this in terms of building a more just and equitable society. We're talking about income levels, but, yeah. So go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, you look at this slide, if you ever have colleagues who say that income doesn't matter, it clearly does on every aspect of this slide. I mean, the fact that it's such a marked, even just going to the above average test score group, that there's a 44-point difference between the same test scores from the resources at the top and resources at the bottom. I mean, this is pretty damning evidence for the idea that even if you wanted this to be a meritocracy, we were doing a good job at it. But I look at this and I think it's one important conclusion to not reach from this is, well, there's nothing we can do about this. This is about income. And this is about where Priya's about to go, is there are things we can do about this that colleges can do to help close this particular gap, which by doing so will also close many classic equity gaps as well.
Yeah, exactly. And a reminder that this is a story of hope. I'm going to kind of breeze through this. There are a couple of resources that I will share at the end of the webinar where you can explore some of these issues in greater detail, and always feel free to ping me and I'll be happy to point out exactly where in the resources you can get that. Just a couple of important points. Context really matters. So what I'm sharing today, it may or may not apply in totality at your institution, and each institution is different in the makeup of your students, the culture of your institution, the types of resources that are available, the priorities of your institution. So I would urge you to decide and figure out what makes sense on your campus. This is where both qualitative and quantitative data could also support this information. And qualitative, I'm really also urging perspective, so student voices, voices of those that work directly with students in terms of thinking about ways to support the student experience. Another important note here is every time we go to college, it is so apparent that there is a lot of work already there. And part of what I'm trying to urge you to consider is how can you elevate the work that is being done? How can you connect? How can you bundle? How can you package? How can you almost re-offer some of the existing services? Because sometimes they're just underused and maybe they're not available to students at the time that they need them. So this is not a story of creating new things. This is not a story of having new responsibilities as much as it is about really looking at existing services and finding out how to make them work better, and really thinking about how students access the services and how to improve that instead of just creating extra things. And lastly, this is not an isolated effort. This is a comprehensive institutional effort. When we talk about financial supports, it is so natural to associate that with the financial aid office or the financial aid department. And this is a plea to say that this is more than just about the financial aid office. This is about how the institution can work together, whether it's part-time faculty, full-time faculty, and staff from various departments, different employees at the institution who come into contact with students. How can they play a role in supporting the ability of students to get the support that they need? And again, not in isolation, that it belongs with conversations around other initiatives on campus as well. Rob?
Yeah, and Priya, I mean, the issue there is, I mean, our friends in financial aid who are doing amazing work on this front have to wrestle with the significant regulation issues at the federal and state levels, and have sometimes a limited ability to go past those regulations, as they are mostly constituted in financial aid offices around the country. So I want to really emphasize this intersection between the wonderful work that financial aid is doing, but also has to have a more global and holistic effort that's connected across the campus, with student services and instruction working together, potentially the foundation at a college working on some financial stability issues as well. So I think that it's really important to just be interconnected.
Yes. Okay, next slide. And so there are different types of benefits for the institution in supporting low-income students. We've already kind of touched on some of those. Supporting students who have financial difficulties can actually improve different types of measures for institutional performance, whether it's improving retention rates, that students actually stay in and finish the term, they persist from term to term, they complete. This can also address calls for accountability that the institution faces, whether it's with accreditation, et cetera. There are also economic gains for the institution. If students stay in longer, there are tuition, state apportionment benefits that are also available. We talked a little bit about this just now, where it can also narrow what we call the achievement gap, which is more of a resources gap, and also strengthen partnerships within the community because, as I mentioned earlier, you're not doing this from scratch yourself. So much of this is also about taking stock of what's already available in your community as far as partners and organizations go, and seeing how they can provide supports for the students as well. Next slide. So we're going to zero in on 4 strategies that can help strengthen the financial stability of students and that can help institutions figure out how to provide that support. Next slide. The first part is to understand the student need. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier about taking stock of what's happening at your institution so that you have a very institution-specific focus on financial stability. The next is to organize and connect the different types of supports that your students need, which also includes the supports that are already available. The third is to then connect partner supports to the students, and partners, I mean both internally to the institution and externally. There are a lot of departments on campus that provide services that can also benefit students, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. And also, just like we talked about earlier, no matter how well programs are designed or services are designed, there's also an intentional effort to connect students to those services and to make sure that students are actually accessing and using them. Next slide. Go ahead. Other quick considerations. The first is to also consider doing some kind of an introspective audit of what is happening at the institution that could accidentally be getting in the way of students. There are many examples of policies and practices that at one time made sense, but now they're actually creating obstacles for students to be able to move forward. So this is as much a process of designing and redesigning it as well as undesigning and removing. Another piece to think about is really about leveraging professional development opportunities when you have new faculty, new staff come in, or you have opportunities for existing staff, faculty, administrators to learn about what is possible. Where can there be training opportunities there? And then as Rob and I just talked about, how can you integrate this into other campus efforts instead of having it be a separate, isolated experience? Next. And so I'm going to come back to Georgia State as far as understanding student needs. So Georgia State University, as I mentioned, did a series of high-impact strategies where they really looked at what kind of strategies can we put in place that will support students in these large-scale efforts. And one of the things that they did called the Panther Retention Grants, I'll talk about in just a minute. But interestingly, just in the last year and a half or so, the alert system that they had before, where if a student did something that was off path or was of concern, somebody would call the student. They actually expanded those alerts to include financial alerts as well. And these financial alerts could be if a student was late in paying a bill or failed to sign up for campus services or chose to live in a single room. This may or may not apply to community colleges, but it was interesting. Chose to live in a single room in a dorm when the aid package covered the cost of a double or more. And so they had all these financial alerts, and they added those as well. So students hit one of those, it sends an alert, and it sends that note to someone who will contact them. The other thing they did that was fascinating was launch a student financial management center last fall, which is basically the financial version of what an advising center would be academically. And so students have individuals that they can go to be able to get one-on-one support. Next slide. And so I kind of want to zero in on one of their strategies as an example of how they're better understanding their students by using data and how they did something as a result of it. So Panther Retention Grants. They had, a few years ago, noticed that many of their incoming students, incoming seniors who were academically eligible in the last stretch, right, this is the last stretch before graduation, were being dropped for non-payment. They didn't pay, they had an outstanding tuition balance, and according to state policy, even if the balance was, a few $100s, according to the policy, they would be dropped. And I think the average balance usually was less than $1,500, which doesn't seem like a lot of money, but when it's $1,500 that you don't have, it's too expensive for the students to cover. And so they got a donation, like an initial seed money, and launched this retention program back in 2011. And within a few hours of the fee drop, basically when the student was dropped, personnel and enrollment services would reach out to the student and offer them a micro grant. And they said that when when they would call the students would actually hang up the phone because they thought it was a prank call. Why would the college be calling the students to tell them that they've absorbed an outstanding amount on their account? And so so students were actually given these micro awards, and they had to do a few things, like they had to meet with a financial counselor to plan out their finances for the rest of their education, but there was no application. And what was amazing was how much this helped students come back into the classroom. I think, let me see my last notes. The program has been able, I think in the last 7 years, been able to bring over 8,000 students back in the classroom. And amazingly, 70% of the students who received the retention grant were able to graduate within 2 semesters of receiving the grant. And the grants average about $900, and then the average revenue that the college earns on the students that re-enter is about $2,500. So according to Tim Rennick, who's been kind of leading the program there, the program underlines this return on investment to the university, and it does so by also promoting the success of students and the completion of students. Next slide. The next strategy that I was talking about was organizing and connecting support. So there might be a variety of supports that your institution already has available. And one example of somehow a way to think about it is what Skyline College in California did through something called SparkPoint. And SparkPoint was a partnership It was part of a regional United Way of the Bay Area network, where they already have these financial education centers that are designed to support people in the community around kind of financial self-sufficiency. And the college worked with United Way to bring a SparkPoint Center on campus. So it would not only be serving Skyline students, but it was also serving the community. And it was a one-stop shop. It offered a variety of services around financial capability and support. And they have, in the last 8 years, seen great improvements in student retention, persistence, and connection to the college. If you go to the next slide, you can talk a little bit about the types of services they do: workforce preparation and education, financial literacy, financial coaching, and then also public benefits and access to public benefits through different types of benefit screening. Next slide. This is something I pulled right off their website that shows a variety of the types of supports that they offer. Now, you may look at this and say our college offers some of these services already, whether these are offered on campus or off campus. The most important note for what Skyline College did was that they bundled these services. Bundling basically means that when a student came in for one service, they were able to learn about other services that they hadn't even considered. And part of that was how this was integrated. So SparkPoint has a staff, and there are people that students will meet with. So when they say, I need help with housing, or I need help with gas, or I need help with childcare, they'll meet with someone in the SparkPoint Center. And then the SparkPoint Center actually, the staff person does a full screening of what else the student might be eligible for, and then based on what their needs are, connect students to those types of resources. And the note that I'm making about bundling is really critical here, because the impact of bundling services can actually be seen in this diagram, for example, for both student retention and persistence. So students who actually receive services persist from the fall to the spring term at higher rates than the college average, which is in that gray bar that kind of cuts through. And as students receive more bundled services, their persistence rates actually continue to increase. So here you'll see the college-wide persistence rate from fall 14 to spring 15 was 64%. And students who received one service persisted at a rate of 79%. But as soon as they received all three services, their rate went up to 97%. And so I really want you to think about where are there opportunities to connect students to more services than they may think they may need. And what are those hubs? Now, SparkPoint obviously has a center, this physical location on campus, and it has people that are devoted, but where are there other opportunities for student interaction, whether it's a college success course or an orientation or different parts of the website? So it doesn't have to be, of course, it's naturally supported in having it be with people, but there might be other points of student interaction where you can embed this. Other colleges have seen success putting in public benefit screenings in their college application. I think Miami-Dade College did that. And so what was amazing about Skyline was just how they were able to bundle and integrate the variety of services that their college was providing. Next.
Yeah, and Priya, I think the important part of that story, and in full disclosure, I used to work at Skyline, but long before they did this, so I take zero credit for it, is that I think the important thing about SparkPoint is although it came to be a physical space with staff that the college is supporting, it originally was an effort to do exactly what Priya is talking about, is to take the wonderful but somewhat unscaled and disparate things the college was doing on financial stability and tie them together and focus on this issue of bundling. I think they learned a lot from LaGuardia on this front, and Michael Basson and his team there. But I do think this is an important concept. That what calling it SparkPoint was not really the important part. The idea was that they had been doing some things that were really useful, and this was both a cause and an effect of some of those things scaling and moving together. So I think it's an important mindset, as Priya said earlier, for the things all of you are doing some of this, right? The trick is how is it bundled? How is it working together? How are you making it consumable for students?
Exactly. And so the next slide actually talks a little bit about that partnership as well. So as I mentioned a little earlier, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you don't have to do it all yourself. There are many experts either at the institution or in the community that are already doing this work that can provide that type of support. So an example here was Destination Graduation, which was a partnership between Seminole State in Florida and the Florida United Way, where what they did was have somebody from the network stay on campus at Seminole and support a variety of students in getting the types of comprehensive services that they need. And so this was a pilot program that was aimed at, as it says, low-income students, first-generation students, and veterans. And it was really around providing support beyond the academics, access to food, a variety of public benefits, child care, health care. Next slide. And in the first year that it was there, they were able to work with 450 students. It cost an average of about $750 to support students through whatever financial crisis they were facing, and they were able to see pretty strong rates of retention and persistence in those students as well. I'm going to pause here because I think partnerships is really underrated. So the last strategy was really focusing on existing supports that you already have. And this strategy is really focused on, so if you find out that at your institution there are certain supports that your students really need more than others, and you may or may not be providing them, one place to look at is partners. You may already have connections in the community with different organizations that are doing some work, but one thing I want to really urge is how can you elevate those partnerships so that the partners come to the students and come to the campus. Traditionally what we do is if a student has a particular need that the college doesn't provide, we tend to send them off campus and we cross our fingers and hope that them not coming back means they got what they needed. And here, what I want to kind of urge us to do is think about how can we bring the partners to the campus, whether it's to have a table at the cafeteria that offers information about services that are available in the community, or bringing representatives into a student success course or an orientation. And so that same part about how do you make sure that students have access to it and don't kind of stumble on it by accident or are looking for only one specific thing when they could be learning about multiple resources. And the same goes for internal partners. There might be departments on campus that could also support student services. For example, accounting departments in multiple colleges have been able to offer their own accounting students kind of credit for preparing taxes through the VITA centers, which are volunteer income tax preparation sites. I've heard about colleges that use their dental programs or their automated programs and provide services to students at subsidized rates in order to be able to support those kind of challenges of a car breaking down or needing some kind of medical attention. Next slide. And then finally, the last support. So regardless of what services you have on campus and regardless of who you partner with in the community, it is so critical to make sure that students are able to access the support. And again, we tend to put the services out there and then students raise their hand and say, I want help with this particular thing. I want us to think about a different type of experience, and you may have already been kind of working on this with the guided pathways about what is the default experience. So is the default experience where students opt in for something, or is the default experience where students opt out for something? And so in this case, if you can go to the next slide, Rob. At LaGuardia Community College, what they did was redesign what the standard student experience would be when they would enter the college. And so every student that would fill out a student application, they would fill out a financial aid application, and they would fill out a benefit screening. This was just the standard experience for all students. And once they filled that out, they would have a meeting with the financial aid advisor, but before that meeting, the advisor would have already been, they would have already reviewed what the student might be eligible for in traditional types of financial aid, like scholarships and grants and loans, but also non-traditional, what kind of public benefits supplemental nutrition or housing subsidies or childcare subsidies the student might be eligible for. And then what they also did, besides putting it as part of the application for every single student, they also embedded this information in other places and spaces that students frequent. So when they were recruiting students in the community, when they were orienting students in the new student orientation, when they were having students in the first year seminar, when they were offering professional development, this was just the kind of standard information and standard support that was available for students as well as everyone who supported students. Next slide. And what they also did was really talk about language. And they framed what could be considered food stamps and housing assistance. They framed it as part of the financial package. It wasn't other types of services. It was just, these are the types of services that a LaGuardia Community College student has access to when they come to school here. They also thought very intently about where to position these types of services and how to make sure, as I mentioned about SparkPoint, when they were bundling services, LaGuardia went so far to figure out how to co-locate services that were related. So financial aid, enrollment, single stop, the food pantry, variety of student services were all co-located together. And so students, when they would visit one, would get these kind of warm handoffs where a staff member might find out that a student could also be eligible for other services, and then they would just walk 50 feet. I actually took a class at LaGuardia Community College and actually went to go see this in person, and it was amazing. I mean, you could stand in one position and see multiple places where you could get multiple services in the same visit. Aside from the Enrollment Services Center, this kind of co-located space for services, they also had information, as I had mentioned, embedded in a variety of other places that students frequent. So the same goes when you're thinking about it at your institution. So when you're thinking about guided pathways and the kind of redesign efforts that you're working on, are there natural spaces where considerations for what additional services or support students might need could play a role? And the easiest way is if you've already been working on kind of designing what the guided pathways experience looks like for students, it might be a filter of thinking about where are there places to integrate conversation and efforts around student financial stability for students as well. We have just a few more minutes. One resource I really want to ping, mostly because Rob and I spent years working on this, is Beyond Financial Aid. This was a guide that Rob and I, with a couple of our colleagues, authored through support from the Lumina Foundation, and it was published a couple of years ago. You can find it online. I have the link at the end of the webinar. And it provides a lot of the information that I'm covering in this webinar about the kind of a literature review and talks about different types of strategies that institutions can employ to support student financial stability, and also has a variety of examples beyond what I've shared in today's webinar. But probably the central resource of the entire guide is an institutional self-assessment. And it basically has a variety of what is possible at the institution as items, and you and your colleagues can get together and almost do a discovery check of what already exists that can be leveraged, what gaps exist, and whether or not those gaps are critical for students and need to be addressed. And it basically lets you know what is our capacity at the institution, what are we already doing, what could we be focusing on, and where might there be resources for us to consider. It also comes with an interpretation guide, so based on how you respond in this institutional self-assessment, it offers some food for additional thought and some pointers on where to go next. And it's available on the Lumina website as well. Next slide. And so here are a couple of other resources besides Beyond Financial Aid. The Institute for Higher Education Policy wrote a tactical guidebook on how to support college students, and there's a portion in there around financial stability that offers some additional resources. And then lastly, I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the Working Family Success Network. This was an effort by 5 or 6 different foundations supported by Achieving the Dream, and it was 19 colleges around the country in 4 states that were launching college-wide version of what used to be known as the Working Family Success Network, and they just wrapped up the 3-year effort, and we put out, I was on the evaluation team, and we put out an evaluation report that actually highlights a variety of other college examples. So depending on what you were interested in today's webinar, there are different efforts that colleges have taken, and these are, you know, colleges that are in rural areas, colleges that are in urban areas, small colleges, big colleges, and so you might find some camaraderie there in what might relate to your work as well. So the report is up, I think it was up just a couple of months ago, and it also offers a variety of additional college examples on how colleges have gone about putting together a food pantry or connecting that food pantry as a resource for other services on campus. So I would really urge you to look there. We have just a few minutes. This went by so quickly. But Rob, are there any questions on the public chat? Or if any of you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat now, and I'm happy to
Yeah, just a couple of minutes left here, Priya. The only one was about how whether or not Georgia State had funded some of their initial stuff with seed money or from a local foundation. And my memory of that is they did not, actually, but they may have used their college foundation to do some of that, which I would expect to be larger given that it's a 4-year institution. Yeah,
I have to remember where the seed funding. I remember the funding was, I think, $400 for a college their size. It was about $400,000 as their seed funding, but I don't remember now. I have to unrest my brain.
Yeah, we can
and
find
I can
that out.
Get back. We can find that out. But I know that they made that up in less time than they had expected because of how successful the program was and how many students came back and completed their program.
So Priya, if you were going to just one place to start, so you know colleges already have things going here. What's one first step you'd suggest colleges take to get a handle around this work?
I would say try to find out where your students face the biggest challenges based on what your faculty, staff, administrators know. Your guided pathways teams, it might be a worthwhile discussion just to have about what resources you've seen students need, and then I would also say maybe think about where students are already going to be interacting with the college, whether it's with the guided pathways work, and where there might be opportunities to embed some of this in there. So I guess I'm thinking out loud. You're hearing my stream of consciousness here. The student experience at your institution, when they interact with different aspects of the college, whether it's through the application or through the orientation or through a student success course, are there opportunities, and if so, what are they, to be able to embed some of this information for students to see where they could access additional resources? So I'd probably start at help students access what's already there instead of creating new things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the suggestion you always give to map the student experience is a great place to start. I mean, we talk about it for guided pathways terms too, but to map the kind of student experience for a particularly low-income student, I think is really relevant as well. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank Priya Chaplow. You're back in the saddle, Priya. It's welcome. It's great to have you back, and my colleague and friend. And I will follow up with any questions to Priya or me, and I will, by the way, get this recording posted as quickly as possible onto Dropbox and send you guys a link to it so you can share it with your colleagues. The next A2I2 webinar will likely be in June. I have a suspicion it will have to do with technology considerations around guided pathways. I'm going to ask my good friend Sarah Zonner from the ADA Center to help us with that webinar as well. So if you have suggestions for future webinars, of course, let me know, and I will be talking with many of you on the phone in the coming weeks and seeing a bunch of you in person in April and May very soon. So thanks again to Priya, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye.